To what?
Do you take it back? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, okay, so in that case, the retraction itself became, we didn't do the story. Again, short science update, breaking news, big story, they don't go together. But the retraction itself became the story. So that was actually good in a way. It looked really bad for Science Magazine, but it became a big story when it was retracted. So I think people who were interested enough to follow the story were also interested enough to find out that it wasn't true. I don't think that always happens. I mean, sometimes the errors are small, they happen later, and your editor probably isn't, even if you want to, isn't going to let you do a story on how something you did 6 months ago probably wasn't as exactly the way you reported it. Especially not in the broadcast media. You don't hear, I can't remember the last time I heard a retraction or anything like that on, sometimes they'll revisit a story, but they'll revisit it because it's interesting or something new happened, not because they want to admit that they got something wrong last March. Very rare.
At one point it could be made, handling these far-out people who turned out to be right, like you run into the problem of high-profile humbuggery, like Immanuel Velikovsky, I think most of us have heard, and Eric von Daniken. These guys won't go away, and if you don't pick, sometimes the scientists or science writers don't pick up on them, you're accused of suppressing the truth. I mean, Velikovsky had a lot of followers in his day, and von Daniken even had a program done about him with Rod Serling as the narrator. I watched it.
And actually Eric von Daniken is how I became a skeptic, because I just bought, I forget how, I was like 13 or 14. I bought into that stuff totally. The Easter Island thing with that had the aliens had to have all that stuff, the Chariots of the Gods thing, and I remember defending it with my dad, who thought it was really dumb, and everybody, and I was like totally behind it. And then when I found out that it was all baloney, I just felt so betrayed that I just flipped the other. I became much more skeptical. So actually, see, he did some good, I guess. In any case, so I just wanted to talk about all these things happen anyway, but they happen more when there, I think, most of them, when there are fewer science journalists. If you're trained in not only journalism, but in science journalism, you learn how to read research papers in fields that you don't know that much about. And that's one of the big things that we did. I was at the Boston University science communications program in the 80s, and so I got my master's in science journalism there. And you really do learn a lot. First off, a lot of people that go into science journalism start out as scientists or science students, but don't know much about journalism and the history of journalism and how it's done, and sources, and accepting things from sources, and all that stuff. So they learn that half of it. And then people who are journalists that don't know much about the science side learn how to read a scientific paper, how to ask questions of people who are smarter than you without being rude or anything, and without seeming, well, you do seem dumb, but you don't care, because you are, compared to them in that field, you are dumb, and you admit that, and you have to learn. And that's what you learn when you study science journalism. Media outlets have cut their staffs tremendously. CNN cut their whole science desk, and just gone. And CNN has become a supplier of stories to other places, sort of like AP or UPI was. So without a science desk, they're not sending as much good science, and the stuff they do is vetted the same way. And in fact, just a few months after they cut their science desk, that story hit. You might remember with I think it was a marathon or a 10-mile run in Texas, I think. And it was all captured on video. And this fireball comes behind the runners. It's really dramatic. and then shoots off, one thing shoots off to one side. And so it became a news, it was a science story that was a news story. And they had on experts on these phenomena, on meteorites and astronomy, saying that it was probably I guess a bolide or some sort of meteorite. I forget what it's called at that point, meteoroid, meteor or something. And that it was heating up in Earth's atmosphere, and the thing that shot off from it was because it was expanding, because it was heating up. And then they went to the ufologist. They said, what do you think it was? And he said, well, this is just the sort of thing, we get these explanations from these so-called experts who say it's a natural phenomenon and we know better and we're being visited. And that was on CNN, and it was just dumbfounding. And I know that if they had a science desk, someone would have stepped in, and hopefully, there would have been a different outcome. So you have general news reporters, and the general news reporters don't have any background in science, are more likely to say, we'll get an expert who believes this, and we'll find someone who believes the opposite, and we'll let them, the experts, duke it out, and we'll just stay out of it. And so you see a lot of that. The whole new media, where you have a lot of people who are journalists because they can be, they have the internet, and it kind of dilutes the whole field. And if you don't have people who are trained in science journalism and can say, well, look, I do this for a living, to be part of that conversation and help moderate it, then it's just kind of the Wild West. It's everybody can say anything they want, and it has the same validity. And one of the things that you see when you don't have people trained in sciences, but they're in journalism, and you see this all the time, is not understanding the difference between correlation and causation. If you find that, if there's some study that says people who eat, Chips Ahoy cookies are more likely to, get into an Ivy League institution, they say, eat more Chips Ahoy cookies and you too may get accepted. There's all sorts of things like that you see in the media that anybody who knew anything about statistics would be able to point out why it's not valid. But it sounds good if you don't understand that. And the whole thing with risk, well, it's like, there's a chance that this thing will cause cancer or this thing will do that. Well, there's a chance, then we have to stop it. We have to put an end to it right now. And so, well, there's a chance that lots of, if you go out in the sunlight, there's a chance you'll get cancer from that, much higher probably than electromagnetic radiation. But that can be lost on them. So I just wanted to, we're at the end, really quickly do a couple of science gone bad stories that I wanted to tell you about. I like this one because I didn't fall for it. This was a press release from a department. This is the fastest supercomputer. It was from a government lab. The person writing the press release got, I think, carried away and said, was it Argonne National Lab? I can't remember. Lawrence Livermore. Develops world's fastest supercomputer. And I was like, well, they're always developed. Everybody's got a new fastest every week. But this was like 4 times faster. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should report on that. So as I'm going through it, I'm down to paragraph maybe 6, and I realized it's not a computer. It's a subroutine. It's a program that does a particular problem, which is a very arcane problem, 4 times faster than has ever been done before. Very interesting to people who study that problem, not too interesting as a general news thing. And I was like, I can't believe I almost fell for the 4 times faster supercomputer in the world. Front page of the Post. Below the fold, but on the front page, National Laboratory develops world's fastest supercomputer, and the person writing for the Post, probably didn't get down to the 6th paragraph or whatever, put it in, and the world won't end over that. It's not, but it just shows, they're busy. It's a newspaper. They have to turn this stuff out fast, and they believed it because it came from a credible source. One of my favorite stories ever that I watched unfold with horror was Jane Pauley and the Killer Tomatoes. She was the host of the Today Show, and she was interviewing these researchers who had done these genetically modified tomatoes. You may have seen this. I'll never forget it. And they were modified to resist a particular virus. And it caused like cell apoptosis, if I remember. It made the cells commit suicide, and it made spots on them. And so this, and there, I think the two researchers who were on the show were partly there to say this is a really cool new development, but also to let people know that these things were safe and you could eat a genetically modified tomato and it would last much longer and that sort of thing. So Jane Pauley's asking them about this. Well, what sort of virus is this? What happens? And, it causes cells to commit suicide, and they lose their cell membranes, and they get all runny, and it causes these unsightly splotches and all this stuff. Within maybe 15 seconds of this report starting, I realized that she thought they carried a virus that killed people. It was like bubonic plague or something. And I thought, this will be interesting because they'll correct her, but no matter how she asked the question, they say, well, who's doing, isn't the government doing something about this? This sounds really serious. And they said, well, yes, she says the Centers for Disease Control, and they said, well, actually, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because it's tomatoes, is saying this. And she said, all right, but I'm sure they're on top of it. And they said, well, yeah, and it is and they were, I think, happy that she was taking it this seriously. It's just, to them, it's like, wow, we're doing really well here. She's really behind the story, sees the importance of this. And so no matter what clues she gave that she didn't understand it, went right over their head. And no matter what they said about, this is a tomato virus, and blah, blah, went right over her head. Said, who cares about the tomatoes? This is spreading. And and it was a long report. It was probably, a few minutes long. And just before station break, they do these little segues, these little cute things to end the segment. And he said, okay, and she wanted to assure people that the tomatoes were safe too, because she didn't want to see this deadly plague run amok. And so she was kind of on their side. Said, okay, I've got 2 tomatoes here. If anybody knows the difference between a genetically modified tomato and another one, just by looking at it, it's you. So which one of these tomatoes, and the way she put it was, is safe to eat? And they kind of looked at each other, and they're like, well, we really can't tell. They were games. I can't tell what's safe to eat by looking at these tomatoes. And she said, this one, because it's got the genetically modified genes, so it's safe for anybody to consume, or whatever like that. Thank you, Dr. So-and-so, thank you. And the camera was on Jane Pauley at that point. And they said, thank you, doctors. And then it cuts to them, and their facial, just then I realized they were getting it. And they said, thank you, Dr. So-and-so. And he went, and then it cut to the commercial. And then when they came back, everything was gone, and the musical act had been set up. And I said, I'm sure they said, we have to go back on. I'm sure she said, no problem, it went really well, and thanks for coming on. And I'm sure they never did a retraction. And anything, the interesting thing is, nothing that was said in the entire interview was factually wrong. But the impression one would get from watching it was there's this terrible disease being spread by tomatoes. But no single sentence was incorrect. It's amazing. And then the last one I want to leave you with is a story, it was 1988. I think it was October 7th. And to me, this is like, they should do entire courses based on this one incident. And I don't know if you would remember it, but evening news, Tom Brokaw comes on, it's the end of the news, and they cut to this person in Alaska. And he's in this little patch of water on this ice field, and there's a whale. Actually, there's a couple of whales in it. You only saw one at a time, so at the time I thought it was just one. And it was trapped, and it was, the ice was freezing over early, and it was going to drown. As soon as that patch went over, this whale was going to die. And so the reporter interviewed a couple of native people there and other folks about it. Well, the next night, it was back. Because this story, people were so compelled by this dying whale's last time on Earth that they had to do a story again. Then other news outlets came to sort of the death. And they said, well, we have to save these whales. We cannot let them die. And saying, well, this is something that happens every year. You know, if you ask the people that live there, it's not unusual in the least. And the only thing that made this a tragedy was that they were gray whales, which weren't particularly tasty or useful compared to other whales. It's a big party when the right sort of whale gets trapped like this because it's free food. It happens all the time, but no one had seen it before. This reporter happened to be there for another story about oil wells or something like that, stumbled upon it. Soon, hundreds of reporters were converging on the spot. It was leading the news on all the networks the next night. President Reagan intervened and said, we have to do something to save these whales. He called Gorbachev. They had an icebreaker in the area that at the cost of millions of dollars they sent to try to get to these whales to save them. And during this period, there was all sorts of news happening. Nobody was paying any attention to it because we were watching these whales that had to be saved, these particular whales, not the whales that died there last year that would die there next year, but these particular whales. And it was at the cost of millions of dollars and the reporters would pay anything to get to this site. So it was a real windfall for the people there that would take them on dog sled or whatever because they would pay anything. So it was this big, it was a windfall for the local people there. And the sad thing was they never could get the icebreaker there. I think the whales did die. And the reporters all left and nobody said anything about it a day later. It had a big PR effect for the Soviet Union. Was like, see, we like whales, even though we kill lots of whales, but we tried to save these ones. And it took on a life of its own for other reasons. But there's a science story that wasn't a story, but became like the biggest story of the year just because where a person happened to be and the fact that he sent that story in and then the way it took off. So questions, discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, I had one. Okay. I'm going to skip this because it's not. I put a case study in that I was going to play for you if we had lots of extra time, and it was just on Marketplace the other day about a new pesticide for strawberries. And you listen to the whole story, you get to the end, and you don't know really. You know that they're using this new pesticide, but you're not given very much information on whether you should be alarmed or not. You're left with a low-level sense of alarm and nothing to do about it. So I was going to play that and we could sort of discuss how they might have done it a little bit differently, but I've gone on long enough already. So questions, comments, yes?
How did your program respond or react when NASA put out the press release saying they had a press conference coming up, a biological discovery that would affect a search for extra life in the universe?
Oh, you mean arsenic?
The so-called arsenic-based life, yes.
That was interesting. Okay, so we got that a week ahead. It was embargoed, and so we're looking at it and we're reading about how it's being spun. And first off, I thought this is probably going to break pretty big just by the way they were talking about it. So anything that we do on Science Update is going to be late. And so I took sort of a wait and see on that. But it wasn't clear to me whether they had found a form of life that it didn't seem that it thrived on. It seemed like it could survive under certain conditions. And it wasn't, I'm sorry, I'm talking as if everybody knows this story. This is a certain type of bacteria can replace phosphorus, which all life needs, with arsenic, which alleged to, right. And so the idea is that, wow, there might be other planets that are high in arsenic and maybe low in phosphorus, or environments within the planets. And we would think, oh, there can't be life there, but maybe there can, which I think is valid. But to me, that doesn't seem at that level, the maybe-maybes, make it a big story. I think if they found that it thrived solely on arsenic instead of phosphorus, then it would bump it up to, yeah, we got to do that because that's kind of cool. But yeah, it became this big thing that they thought that the story, well, in one sense, it's not the researchers' fault that their story broke so big, because I'm sure they didn't put it the way the press release put it. Or maybe they did, but oh, she did? Oh, okay. Then it was their fault. But in many cases, they do this, and they're like, well, we kind of never said it in those terms, but, you know. Anyway, yeah, that's a classic. And it was just recently. I'm sorry, who's next?
Oh, well, I was going to say, along those lines, like, what do you think the responsibility is for researchers and scientists to be better about communicating their stuff to journalists or to the public?
Yeah, well, it's first off, I totally think it is asking a lot of them. It's not. A lot of people just want to do their work, and they will write it up dutifully in scientific form, but maybe don't feel that confident speaking to the press. So, you know, when they won't talk to me or when I can't do this, I don't always think of it as arrogance. I think that, but we have a program at AAAS that's supposed to help people engage with the press better, and it's these courses, and they tell you how to prepare, and what's funny is they often tell the researchers do all the things I don't want them to do. Like, I want to talk to the researcher when I call. I don't want to set up an appointment because, I have a lay audience. I know they can answer these questions. They don't need to have all of the papers and references in front of them for the questions I'm going to ask, probably. And if they prepare, they are going to be reading, and you'll hear the pages turning when I ask the questions because they've got it all in front of them. And it's just deadly. And I said, no, let's just chat. Just answer these few questions. If you don't like it, or if you think of something, just call me back, or whatever. Well, the people coaching the scientists tell them, don't take a phone call and answer, then tell them you'll get back to them. Prepare completely. Understand exactly what you want to say. Well, then there's very few, anybody, I was going to say science, very, very few humans who can do that and still sound engaging and everything, and it's just going to be deadly. But yeah, hopefully they will see that as a responsibility. The NSF now gives you extra money to engage with the public when you get your grant. You can apply for, I think, up to $75,000 just to tell the world about what you're doing in a clear way. So that's really good. Way in back first, and then I'll...
So with all of this, if Isaac Newton was living today, would you have gone along if we put out this press release? I have this idea that this thing fell on my head, and I have this. Would it have got lost in the weeds?
Well, he wouldn't talk to anybody. He was kind of a what's the word? Recluse. Yeah, I guess Voltaire came to see him, and he went out, traveled all this way, and Newton said, no, I'm busy, sorry, and sent him away. Yeah, so I don't know. I think that that's a case where he actually did put things down just the way you want to see them, and it was peer-reviewed to the extent that things were peer-reviewed back then, like lots of other people weighed in on them. So I think that it's the other people, the people who just stumble upon some blindingly brilliant thing and try to tell the world that you wonder if anybody, even now, would pay attention. I think he probably would get his stuff out. I don't know. Yeah.
What sort of feedback do you get from the subjects of your shows? Do they get back to you and say, "Oh, good job," or do they give constructive criticism?
Usually yeah, because we send links to the scientists, and they often will say nice things, and it's sometimes. You know what, the one thing they're the most upset about, which I'm happy, is the thing that is at the top, is that we didn't credit enough people. We didn't credit their the head of their lab or the people. But if I can barely credit them in 1 minute. It's so short, and you know, and they don't want to come off as a media hound. You know, they fear that more than, you know, the stuff won't get out or will be misunderstood, as they fear that they'll think of them as a. And you know, Carl Sagan, you know, he's a saint now, but when he was alive, he was criticized up and down for being a media hound and for, you know, for all that kind of thing. So so they really fear that. But no, we haven't gotten. I can't think of someone who's really been ticked off at us recently. On the other hand, we're not reporting the way a good reporter should be and being really critical. We're taking stories peer-reviewed it's either true, either the dog knows 1,000, this is this dog that knows 1,000 symbols, which actually I don't know if we're going to do or not. But once you believe the story, once the scientific researcher probably isn't the one who's going to take you to task for it. Someone else may think that, So it's pretty rare. And I thought there was another one way in that. Yes.
Just a comment. Unfortunately, sometimes you have researchers who spin the story.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking particularly of Andrew Wakefield and his claims about the connection between vaccines and autism.
Oh.
I mean, he was egregious.
Yeah.
In that regard.
Yeah.
And of course, the press went along with it, but of course, they wouldn't have known all of the fraud that he committed.
It's the sort of thing where you have to. They probably felt, I've got to do the story because what if it is true? And at that point, and well, back then it was peer reviewed, so you'd be amiss if you didn't cover the story.
Do you get any kind of feedback from, say, like creationists or the religious flat earthers?
Yeah. We sometimes hear from folks that, because our whole thing in that is we just take mainstream things as sort of matter of fact. So, I just did a story on this is kind of a cool thing, and it's borderline, but it was too interesting not to do. Wait, is this embargoed? What's today? No, I think this is fine. Yeah, I think. Anyway, it was a really cool story where they date the advent of clothing based on genetic analysis of clothing lice. And so they looked at the mitochondrial DNA, I guess. Oh, okay. So I think it came out this week. It was probably embargoed until Thursday. So they looked at genetically, you can use the DNA as sort of a clock to see when they diverged from head lice. And apparently clothing lice can't live on a naked body. They have to have clothes. So they say, well, when they diverged, that must have been when people first started wearing clothing, and they put it 170,000 years ago. Well, I didn't explicitly mention the Garden of Eden, and the first time people wore clothes because they knew shame, which was 6,000 years ago. So, but obviously they already did have clothes because they were clothing lice. So I didn't point that out, but I certainly did say it was 170,000 years ago, and here's where it happened, And people do sometimes respond to that. When they really respond, a percentage of science updates get used in Science NetLinks, which is a website for teachers, and there's a whole lesson built around them. And when there's a lesson built around something like that, teachers, parents object. What are you trying to tell our kids? There were no people 170,000 years ago. And the other one was we did a thing on children of same-sex couples being remarkably, I thought, remarkably well-adjusted. They couldn't be discerned. They couldn't be told apart from kids of heterosexual, male-female families in this whole battery of tests of self-esteem and this, which was kind of a remarkable thing because you'd think they'd have at least some pressures. And so I thought that was newsworthy. We did that, and boy, that got some blowback. I thought there's a hand way back here before you said, yeah.
This is a little bit of an expansion on the Wakefield thing. But yesterday I was listening to public radio, Science Friday, and they did a whole section on this issue of the fraudulent experiment. And they had people call in, and almost all the people who called in basically said, nothing's going to change my mind. It doesn't matter that it's fraudulent, it's not going to change my mind. I don't believe the government, and I don't know why they thought this was the government, but I don't believe the government. And when I hear about what you mentioned at the beginning, about what is science literacy, what creates the seasons, why a tree grows, whatever, none of these things, the things that I hear we put on tests to measure science literacy, don't help the average person make a decision about science when they're faced with having to make a decision. And I don't hear reporting dealing with helping people learn how to make a decision in the area of science. What should they evaluate? I don't hear, it seems to me as though so much of our efforts for science literacy are not helping people get along in the real world. And I also don't know how you present information to, I don't want to give up on it. There's got to be a way to present information to those who believe that there's nothing you can say that could change their mind.
Well, I think when you present counterintuitive things that are shown by science that aren't as loaded as something like that has contagion, which is the autism thing, or not contagion, taint, and they start to see, oh, counterintuitive things, even though that seems like it should be right, this other thing is right, and here's the evidence that led to it, that if you do enough of that, this is what I hope anyway with Science Update, that they will then translate that into, well, even though it seems, this kind of makes sense that this person had a vaccination, and then got autism the next day, so it's cause and effect, maybe that's not true either, because I've seen all these other cause and effect things, or these other correlations that weren't cause and effect. So I think presenting people with lots and lots of those till they get to the point where, obviously I'm not going to believe that just based on that. I need more evidence, would work.
That it's not, what you're saying to me is not logical, and I'm going to go on logic. That's not science.
Yeah, well, but it's it's a part of the brain that's built, but that's more powerful than the frontal parts that are making those logical decisions. And it's like, I mean, would you, if I said, there's only a little bit of urine in this, so much that you wouldn't even know, would you drink it? There's a powerful thing saying, what he said there was, it's not logical because it won't hurt you. And I had a roommate, one cockroach was seen on one plate in the cupboard. Everything got taken out and completely washed. I say, but you just saw the cockroach. It's probably, that could have happened to any plate yesterday, the day before. You're going to clean these all the time? And he said, no, it's psychological. And I know it's psychological, but can't you undo it based on logic? I think, there's one over here, I think was the...
Yeah, but I also, excuse me, it may be more timely for me to comment on your question. Because I can give her a little bit of a background when she was talking about how we measure science literacy. Well, I did that for many years at NSF. And I can give you a little bit of background. You said at the beginning of your talk that NSF does this survey. Well, that's really not true anymore. It hasn't actually done such a survey in 10 years. And however, you mentioned something else that gives you a clue. And that is, you mentioned a recent survey done at Michigan State.
Yeah.
Well, the fellow at Michigan State you're talking about is the one who used to do the NSF survey.
Oh, I did notice a similarity.
And the kinds of questions that you were asking about is part of his research. In other words, how should I put this? 10 years ago, we were measuring what you were asking about, but it's not being done anymore. What did they do? Anyway, so I just wanted to we can talk about it later.
Yeah, well, right in the same range here, it's ironic. In the last 2 days, I've been engaging in an internet polemic with someone on the Wakefield issue and trust and distrust of educated elites and scientific information. And we got into when did people start understanding that the Earth goes around the sun and not vice versa. And she was quite convinced it was medieval elites who repressed the knowledge that otherwise the common people had, that the Earth went round and went around the sun. It was just scholastic elites to repress that on the basis of authority. And otherwise the common people would have all believed it, and so we should be always suspicious of elites. That was inventive, I've got to say.
Yeah.
But I think the fundamental issues are, how does one reestablish a reasonable balance of acceptance of responsible communities of peer review, and at the same time reasonable surveillance of elites? What are the reasonable balances? What are elites that should be trusted? What are elites that shouldn't be trusted? And it's very clear from the people you mentioned who said they would never believe any of it because it was them, the government. Them, the government, includes corporate elites. It includes the security agencies of government. It includes drug companies. It does not include the welfare agencies of government usually. It's one political side of the spectrum usually. Or the other political side of the spectrum, each with its very fixed suspicions.
It's whatever impediment there is to your belief.
Yeah.
But how do you make people self-aware enough to question what they believe, to think about, well, why do I believe that? Who does that? You know, not many people even think about thinking or why.
The media does cultivate some of these suspicions, including some very irrational.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just, I'm sorry.
I think one or two more.
I'm not sure who is, who hasn't asked a question at all, though? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about your role and as someone in the government science who has been called up numerous times. The thing I've always wanted, if I was explaining something that was more than very simple, is for them, before they send it out, to just read it to me over the phone or send me a copy of it and let me say, yes, you got it right, or no, this was an easy thing to screw up and you screwed it up.
Yeah.
In every case, I was told that's censorship, and I will not submit myself to it. This is a problem a scientist or a subject matter expert has with journalism. They have their deadlines, but they do not want to come back to you with what they're going to finally put out as their understanding of what you told them. And I found the error rate to be 30 or 40% when I was doing economics-related things in the regulatory area. That's fairly complicated. And invariably, they would make the sentence sound more elegant and often reverse the meaning. It was quite scary.
We do that, and it goes. We will go back to you and say, "Is this right?" We'll even give you the script. But I think that's and only if they we don't do it all the time just because of time. But there are certain topics we'll do it with, but it's because we're not doing the same type of journalism that others are doing. For instance, if you interviewed Oliver North and he said, "Well, I want to read what you're saying about me before it goes up," and you say, well, you know, just to make sure you got it right. Well, you know, so the people who are, you know, coming at it from a more journalistic perspective are going to say, well, of course I'm not going to read it back to you. You told me everything. It's my job to get it right, and if it's wrong, then I screwed up. But because what we're doing is mostly reporting what's happening in the world of science in peer-reviewed journals or at conferences or things, we want to be true to that, you know, that research, and so that's what's more important. It's not, you know, it's not a news story in the same vein as the Oliver North story would be, say. Anyway, so the people that you've talked to probably see themselves more as in that other role. But yeah, if they could at least say the scientific part of it back and say, do I have it right, that would certainly go a long way.
The big problem was always when it got quantitative. The journalist said, I happened to run into a bad string of them that couldn't handle anything quantitative without screwing it up often by many orders of magnitude.
Or when there's a good story.
They always spelled my name right and attributed it to me.
And then you have to explain it to other people. Why did you say that? No, sometimes there's a good story just to the side of the real story, and you so want it to be that great story. And I've had people, and I've had reporters, you know, people working for me do it. I say, well, that's not true. It's exactly not true. And they say, well, but it's so cool, and it's not. And there are always things that aren't going to be life-threatening. Well, what if the parrot did this, or what if there's stories that are kind of fun. And I say, I know it would be great. It would have been great, and that's the story we thought it was when we decided to do it. But then it ended up not being that story, so we can't say that anymore. Yeah, sir. Wow. Thank you. Thanks for having me.